You are standing in the Winter Palace, the air heavy with the scent of pine and something metallic, something like the end of an era. It is November 1796. The greatest sovereign in Europe, Catherine the Great, lies still on a massive imperial bed, her breath having finally surrendered to silence. Outside, the bells of St. Petersburg toll, marking the official end of 34 years of relentless, transformative rule. Inside these gilded walls, the physicians confirm the stroke, a quiet, abrupt, biological failure. Yet, almost before the body has cooled, something far more volatile begins to circulate than the news of death itself. It is not an obituary of conquest or enlightenment. It is a whisper, a venomous current aimed directly at the woman who dared to hold the largest empire on earth. You sense the immediate dangerous chaos that follows the fall of a great ruler, knowing that truth is the first casualty in the scramble for legacy. The palace courtiers, the diplomats, and the common people did not choose to remember the libraries she filled, the territory she annexed, or the philosopher she corresponded with. They chose the grotesque. The lie that begins to spread is theatrical, vile, and irresistible. Catherine did not die from natural causes. She was crushed, the story claims, in an act of depravity involving a stallion and a pulley system that catastrophically failed. The rumor is preposterous, physically impossible, born of the deepest contempt for a powerful woman. But that is precisely why it travels faster than a courier on the road to Vienna. It slips from the darkened corridors of the palace to the saloons of Paris, mutating into a legend designed not merely to slander her private life, but to defile her monumental achievement. This is the first crucial lesson about dark history. Sometimes the most enduring violence is committed against a person's memory. To understand why such a specific, absurd, and humiliating rumor could seize the European imagination, you must first acknowledge the scale of the woman they sought to destroy. Catherine was not born to this destiny. She was Sophia Augusta Frederica of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess thrust into the Byzantine complexity of the Russian court at the tender age of 14. Her journey was not a fairy tale, but a methodical, calculated campaign of adaptation. Her first and most immediate enemy was her husband, the heir Peter III, a man who proved pathologically unfit to rule and openly despised his wife. The young Catherine observed, learned, and endured 17 years of humiliation and neglect, realizing that survival required a total reinvention of the self. She understood that in the Tsarist court, invisibility was death, but the wrong kind of visibility was also fatal. As you look back on the early years, you see the tension building like a fault line ready to split the continent. Peter III's brief rule, beginning in 1761, was a political disaster, a rapid descent into chaos. Antagonized the powerful Orthodox Church, alienated the nobility, and, most fatally, insulted the imperial guard by praising their Prussian enemies. He was a tyrant without the intelligence or will required for tyranny, and he compounded his failure by making clear his intention to discard Catherine, whether by divorce, exile, or imprisonment. Peter failed to realize that the woman he dismissed as a quiet German ornament had spent nearly 2 decades building a secret, loyal foundation within the army and the court. She had mastered the language and the religious rituals of Russia, transforming herself into a symbol of Russian legitimacy, while Peter remained a petulant foreign boy king playing with toy soldiers. Then came the moment that changed history. In 1762, with Peter marching blindly toward his own destruction, Catherine acted. Backed by the Orloff brothers and the regiments she had secretly cultivated, she staged a coup d'etat that was swift and nearly bloodless. Peter was forced to abdicate. Within days, he was dead, the exact circumstances forever shrouded in the convenient ambiguity of palace intrigue. Catherine, a woman with no drop of Russian blood, was proclaimed empress and autocrat of all Russia. The stakes were absolute. She had seized the crown by an act of political violence, an act that violated every convention of European monarchy. You realize that this moment, this singular act of audacious survival, is the root of the subsequent hatred. A woman who conquers an empire and a woman who dethrones and likely eliminates her husband creates enemies whose grudges will not die, even when she does.
Catherine the Great did not govern gently. Her rule was defined by a stunning duality: enlightenment on the surface, iron beneath. She immediately ushered in a cultural renaissance, corresponding with intellectual titans like Voltaire and Diderot, buying staggering quantities of art to create the Hermitage, transforming St. Petersburg into a refined capital. But this dazzling intellectual performance masked the relentless, brutal ambition of her foreign policy. Her armies marched south and west, crushing the Ottoman Empire, securing the Black Sea, and, most ruthlessly, participating in the partitions that carved Poland off the map of Europe entirely. She was, simultaneously, the patron of philosophy and the most formidable military strategist of her age. This inherent contradiction, the philosopher queen who ruled with the fist of an iron czar, was difficult for Europe to reconcile, and it was this complexity that the future rumors would seek to simplify and destroy. But beneath the glowing veneer of intellectualism, the vast, suffering reality of the Russian Empire persisted. Millions of serfs lived in conditions of near slavery, bought and sold like property, enduring the capricious cruelty of their noble masters. In 1773, the fragile order fractured. Yemelyan Pugachev, a Cossack claiming to be Peter III, returned from the
grave, ignited a colossal peasant rebellion. It was a wildfire that threatened to consume the entire structure of the state, fueled by legitimate rage and the promise of liberation. For a terrible year, Catherine felt the empire tremble. She crushed the revolt not just with military precision, but with ceremonial brutality. Pugachev was captured, dragged in a cage to Moscow, and publicly executed, a spectacle intended to freeze disobedience in the collective memory of the peasantry. The rebellion hardened Catherine, extinguishing any lingering idealistic tendencies she held toward reform. Stability now demanded absolute obedience, and obedience demanded the tightening of chains. She expanded the nobility's power over the serfs, ensuring that while her court sparkled with enlightened ideals, the countryside descended further into inherited suffering. This is the moral paradox that historians still wrestle with. She admired the concepts of freedom and human dignity, yet she was unwilling to risk her throne or the stability of the state to implement them for the people beneath her. Her actions revealed a leader who valued the survival of the empire and her personal authority above all else. 10 years later, the echoes of this contradiction would feed the very propaganda aimed at destroying her. While her political brutality was often overlooked by Europe's courts, who practiced their own forms of oppression, her personal life became the immediate target. Catherine's relationships with her favorites were numerous, public, and governed by her own rules. She chose her lovers, showered them with titles and estates, and when the affairs ended, she ensured their comfortable retirement, a strategy far more generous and calculated than that employed by most male monarchs. Yet, because she was a woman seizing both political and sexual autonomy, the narrative in Europe was immediately poisoned. She was painted not as a strategist managing loyalty, but as a depraved sensualist ruled by uncontrollable appetites. They ignored her conquests and highlighted her bedroom, creating the blueprint for the final, ultimate slander that would follow her into the grave. Grill of a Sovereign is never just a personal tragedy, it is a political opportunity. When Catherine suffered her final stroke in her private bathroom and passed away hours later, the facts were immediately available: witnesses, doctors, records. But facts were immaterial to those who had accumulated decades of venomous resentment. Her own son, Paul I, who harbored a deep, lifelong resentment fueled by suspicion over his father's fate, did little to protect her memory. The political stage was set for the culmination of the character assassination. Enemies from across Europe, the revolutionary French, traditionalist monarchies, exiled Polish nobles, could not undo her victories or her vast territorial expansion. Their last, desperate weapon was narrative destruction. The initial slander was predictable, echoing the years of accusation that she was insatiable and reckless. But ordinary insults were insufficient to dismantle a figure as colossal as Catherine. The lie needed to be grotesque, theatrical, and humiliating enough to overshadow 3 decades of historical achievement. And so, the ultimate perverse fantasy was born: the myth of the horse. A story so physically impossible and profoundly vulgar that it cut through the noise of history. It did not matter that it defied logic, gravity, and every documented witness account of her final hours. What mattered was was the shock, the indelible image of humiliation that reduced the formidable empress to a pitiable victim of her own alleged perversion. You must acknowledge the sheer effectiveness of this cruelty. It was designed not to describe her life, but to define it. The genius of the rumor lay in its ability to simultaneously punish her gender and diminish her power. If she could be reduced to a creature ruled entirely by base lust, then her conquest, her reforms, and her sheer political intelligence could be safely dismissed as accidents, or worse, byproducts of her depravity. Society could accept male tyrants who conquered continents. They struggled to accept a female sovereign who conquered and commanded better than most men. The horse myth, therefore, was not a piece of gossip, but a carefully engineered political mechanism. It traveled across borders, passed down in drawing rooms and taverns, until the grotesque lie became, for many, the singular fact of Catherine's life, suffocating the immense reality beneath it. The persistence of this vicious lie, centuries later, compels us to reflect not just on Catherine, but on the enduring fragility of historical memory. Catherine's life was indeed one of stunning moral contradiction. She corresponded with thinkers who preached liberty while simultaneously tightening the grip of serfdom. She built one of the world's great museums on the foundation of human bondage. She spoke the language of progress, but enforced the policies of absolute autocracy. This complexity, the brilliant, brutal, calculating reality of her rule, was too challenging for her enemies, and indeed, for history itself. It was far easier to simply invent a monster whose death matched the moral simplicity they wished to assign her. Yet, when you strip away the layers of slander, the truth that remains is arguably more disturbing than the fiction. Catherine was a figure of tremendous, terrifying competence. She expanded Russia's territory by hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, stabilized a failing empire, and forever shifted the balance of European power. She was not a monster of pure evil, nor a figure of pristine virtue, but a pragmatic, relentless ruler who understood that the survival of her power depended on absolute calculation and the effective use of both force and philosophy. Her great failing, in the eyes of her
contemporaries, was that she dared to be a sovereign first and a woman second. The rumor crushed the truth, but it could not crush the foundations she laid. The hermitage still stands. The borders she expanded remain largely intact. Her legacy is etched not in the gossip sheets of 1797, but in the map of Eastern Europe and the history of modern Russia. The story of Catherine the Great is ultimately a testament to the power of systemic hatred against female ambition, a hatred so profound that it required inventing a scenario so ridiculous it transcended logic. This video is created for educational and historical purposes. It examines themes of power, corruption, and human conflict without depicting explicit or graphic events. And so, we are left with the great paradox of Catherine II, a woman of profound intellect and even more profound cruelty, whose real story was overshadowed by a vulgar fantasy. It begs the question, what does it say about humanity that we often prefer the satisfying simplicity of the monstrous lie over the challenging complexity of the historical truth? If this story made you reflect on how easily power turns to cruelty and how quickly that cruelty is rewritten into slander, stay with us. Subscribe for the next chapter from the darker corners of human history, where the truth rarely dies quietly.